Well, hello there, my friends, and welcome back. My name is Stephanie Safarian, and you're listening to episode 592 of Sustainable Minimalists. This is a listener-supported show about intentional and eco-friendly minimalist living. And on today's show, we're talking about plastic. More specifically, we're talking about why we keep making more plastic, despite the fact that it's littering our communities, choking our waterways, polluting our air, and harming our health. Now, I want to take a step back and I want you to call to mind the last piece of plastic you had. You either threw it in the trash can or the recycling bin. So maybe it was a takeout container, maybe it was a plastic bottle, maybe it was even packaging from an online order. If you're like most people, you probably felt a little twinge of guilt when you threw it out. If you put it in the recycling bin, maybe that helped to assuage a bit of that guilt. But what if I told you that the guilt you felt was meticulously designed, manufactured, and sold to you by some of the most powerful corporations on Earth? How would you feel about that? The fossil fuels and plastic industries turned Americans on to a disposable lifestyle on purpose. And then they turned around and made us feel guilty for being so wasteful. They touted recycling as the solution, and recycling certainly distracted us for a few decades. And now they're touting chemical recycling as the latest solution, and I'm doing solution in air quotes, as the latest solution to plastic and its proliferation. Meanwhile, these industries continue to make more and more plastic. Why? Why are they doing it? Well, that's easy. It's because as the world shifts to electric cars and renewable energy, big oil is staring down a drop in fuel demand. And plastic then is their financial lifeline. ExxonMobil, Saudi Aramco, and other petrochemical companies have big plans to double or even triple plastic production in the coming years. Triple. Think about that. Think about how much plastic is at the grocery store right now. They're planning to triple it. So today we're flipping the script. For decades, we've talked about plastic in terms of its end life, like what it's doing, where it ends up, our personal responsibility to use less plastic. My guest today argues that we need to stop talking about plastic's end life and start talking about who's making all this plastic and why. So my guest is Beth Gardner. Beth is an environmental journalist. She's also the author of the brand new, really great book titled Plastic Inc., The Secret History and Shocking Future of Big Oil's Biggest Bet. Oh my gosh, Beth, I am so thrilled to talk to you today. How are you?
Hi, likewise. Glad to be with you. I'm good. Thanks.
Well, I came across your book, Plastic Inc. I saw it written about in the New York Times, and I thought to myself, holy moly, that's my book. I got to read it. So I read it.
Amazing. You're my reader.
I read it in a weekend, and it just fired me up. So I want to know about you. Who are you? What do you do? And why on earth did you decide to write hundreds of pages about plastic?
Yeah, great questions. And I'm so happy to be with you too. So I'm an environmental journalist. I'm an American, but I live in the UK, which actually provides an interesting perspective sometimes on plastic going back and forth. It's funny, my first book was about air pollution. And the reason that I wrote that was that it felt to me like that was an issue that we are not talking about enough in comparison to the impact that it has on our health. Plastic is a different thing. We do talk about it a lot, right? But I guess what I realized when I started researching a little bit is that I feel like we think about this wrong, which is largely to do with obviously the narrative that the industry has pushed, but also the way that it is covered in the media and the way that plastic gets talked about. To me, it feels like is so focused on either where it ends up. We are all familiar with these terrible pictures of turtles choking on bags or beaches carpeted with trash, focused on either where it ends up or how we can personally use less. And what we're not talking about is where plastic comes from, which of course is the fossil fuel industry and its close sibling, the petrochemical industry. And for me, this kind of started with the backstory, of course, is that I imagine, like you, I have always been that person who is trying to use less plastic. I'm carrying my bags to the store. I bring my water bottle with me. I feel bad if I am so thirsty that I have to buy bottled water when I'm out for a walk or whatever. So that's like the background. And then one day, like 7 or 8 years ago now, I saw this headline in The Guardian, and the article was about the fossil fuel industry, these huge companies like ExxonMobil and Saudi Aramco pouring hundreds of billions of dollars into their plans to ramp up plastic production and double, potentially triple the amount of plastic that they make every year in the decades to come. So it just, like, took my breath away because here I am, this one, like, tiny little person, and obviously I'm one of many. I know there's so many people out there like me who just feel like there's something wrong with the volume of plastic that comes into and quickly goes out of our lives, while so many of us are trying to use less. These gigantic companies are making more and more every year and planning to increase that even further in the decades to come. So I think when I saw that, I wouldn't say I began working on the book like the next day, but it just planted this seed. And the more that I started reporting and digging into it, the more I just really felt that this is a huge kind of gap in the coverage journalistically. And it's having a knock-on effect in terms of how we think about plastic. And so basically, to me, this book is my effort, I think, to shift the lens on plastic away from where it ends up and towards where it comes from, away from that personal responsibility framing that we are so familiar with as Americans on every issue, and onto a corporate and political accountability lens, because I think that's what's driving this problem, and that's where the answers lie.
Yeah, as I started on my own eco-conscious journey, let's say, I started taking a critical look at all the plastic in my life. I did what the plastic industry wanted me to do, which was say,
Yes.
oh, personal responsibility. I'll just use less of it. I'll
Mhm.
just take home less from the supermarket, ask for Amazon to package myself in minimal packaging, and that will solve the problem. But very quickly, I learned that it's actually impossible to use significantly less plastic as a singular person in 2020, whatever. And
Yes.
that's because you write that, quote, some of the world's richest and most powerful corporations are pushing with all their might to keep plastic relevant, to keep making more and more. You had another stat in your book that really fired me up. You said by 2050, 1.1 billion metric tons of plastic could be made in a single year, which sounds
Mhm.
like a lot, but that number's so big, how do you even know how much? Well, you continue, you say the cumulative total would be enough to cover the entire United States in a layer ankle deep. That
Yes.
is insane. That's crazy. I want to get into the big players that are pushing all this plastic down our throat. But before we do, maybe we can just very briefly, 3 minutes or less, talk about the problems associated with plastic. Because I likely don't have many listeners who are thinking, well, why should I care? But I might have some. So
Yes, maybe I would focus on the ones that are less obvious, right? Because I think that we're all familiar with the way that this material is just scattered over the entire earth now, right? It's been found in the deepest trenches of the ocean and on top of Mount Everest. So we understand, I think, the scale and sort of horror of plastic pollution and what that might mean to sea creatures or birds or whatever who are choking on pieces of plastic. But some of the less obvious harms, I think, are number one, the climate impact. So there was one analysis that found that if plastic were a country, it would be the fifth biggest contributor globally to greenhouse gases. Even as an environmental journalist, I think that I, for many years, thought of climate change and plastic as kind of separate problems, right? These are two ecological catastrophes, but different. And in fact, what I learned is that they're deeply interconnected because, number one, plastic production is incredibly energy intensive. These giant facilities that are pumping out plastic, they're so big that they typically have their own gas power plant on site, right? There's one outside of Pittsburgh that opened 4 or 5 years ago that is estimated to have the same carbon footprint as almost 500,000 cars. So that is a gigantic impact, not to mention that a great deal of plastic ends up being incinerated. It's a fossil fuel, so that is a big climate hit. And on top of all that, this material is essentially functioning as a subsidy to the fossil fuel industry. Well, we can dive into this a little bit more later, but it is enabling these gigantic oil companies and gas companies. What they hope is that of selling more and more plastic will enable them to perpetuate their business model of drilling, continuing to drill for as long as they possibly can, which, as we know, is catastrophic for our climate. So that's number one, the climate impact. Number two is the health impact on the people who live next to these facilities, which are producing plastic, giant petrochemical plants. I went to Texas and Louisiana. The Gulf Coast is the heart of American plastic production. You probably won't be surprised to hear that the communities living next door to these plants are disproportionately communities of color and low-income communities. They are breathing in all kinds of carcinogens and toxins, and they are living with frighteningly regular explosions and extreme situations, fires, where people are forced to shelter in place at home for sometimes days on end. I'm talking about places like Houston, the lower Mississippi Valley, in Louisiana. And then the third thing I would flag is the human health impact on all of us who are surrounded by plastic products containing our food, our drinks. We are wearing them. We are sitting on them in our furniture, right? And I'm sure we'll talk more about what that means for our health, but I'll just say here that it's not good.
Okay, that was an excellent, quick, but comprehensive answer, Beth. Thank you so much. Yeah, I would just say plastic begins as oil in the ground, right? And it needs to be extracted from the ground, shipped around the world, turned into resins, then shipped some more, turned into pellets, then shipped some more to be turned into, our plastic fork, our plastic bottle. And at every stage of the create a plastic thing process, it's polluting our air, polluting our water, polluting the communities, as you aptly said, near these facilities. But it's also polluting and impacting the health of us who may not live anywhere near a manufacturing facility. Microplastics are in our brains, in our placentas. The impacts are not even yet known because this is such an emerging threat and the science hasn't caught up yet. And
yes,
you alluded to it, but let's really just call out the elephant in the room. Big oil is continuously pushing plastic down our throats, even though there are plenty of people like you and me are saying, hey, we don't want it. Talk to me about how fossil fuel industries got us hooked on plastic post-World War II. Like, how did we get here?
This is such a rich question, right? There's a lot there. And I delve into it in the book. So when you talk about the plastic industry, it's got a lot of players, right? So there's the oil and petrochemical companies who are producing the plastic. This is the Exxon Mobils and the Shells and the Dow chemicals. And then there are the manufacturers producing packaging, making the bottles, making the bags, making the products. And then you have the companies that are using plastic. So this is the Cokes, the Pepsis, the Procter & Gamble's that are delivering it into our lives more directly. These companies they're independent actors, but together their actions have had the effect of building this plastic world that we live in. And I think the thing that shocked me the most kind of in reporting that history is the intentionality of it, the way that the industry, that collection of industries that I just described, really spotted the profit potential in disposability. And in some ways, I think that the problem that we have today is almost less about plastic as a material, although it does have some unique harms, and it's more about disposability as a model. So what you see when you look back to the dawn of what I would say is the modern era of plastics, which is like the immediate post-World War II years, plastic had some. I'm the first person to say that plastic has some very valuable uses. Polyethylene, which is now the world's most common plastic, was initially used by the Allies in World War II to coat radar cables. And this was a huge innovation from the previous coating that they were using. It was much, much lighter, so it meant that you could put radar in planes and use it much more widely and much more adeptly. That had a huge impact in turning the tide actually against the Nazis. So that is super valuable, right? But then you come to the peacetime economy, and the industry sees that, okay, there's a certain amount of pent-up demand. People are going to be buying stuff that they couldn't get during the Depression and during the war. But after that, we need to find a way to keep selling plastic because they had hit on this material and all these different iterations of it that they could come up with different kinds of chemical experimentation. And you have in the sort of late 1950s, this big plastic industry conference, and this guy, this sort of journalist in the industry named Lloyd Stouffer, stood up in front of a conference in New York City of plastic executives, and he said that single use, because this was a time where, for example, Coca-Cola was operating this gigantic system of reuse, right? Where you would return your glass bottle after you finished your soda, and they would go back to the plant and be refilled. One bottle could be reused 50, 60, 70 times. And Lloyd Stouffer stood up in front of this conference, and he said that is a lost opportunity for profit because we only sold one bottle. We could have sold 50 bottles. And he said single use offers the potential of sales in the billions of units, recurring sales, because you are selling a new bottle every time somebody buys a Coke. This obviously was not confined to beverages. It happened to, you could see every product category in your supermarket, your pharmacy, whatever, right? So it was absolutely intentional that the industry created this idea of disposability. It was more profitable to them because if you're making a bottle, you want to sell more bottles. And it was more profitable to the Cokes and the Pepsis and the consumer product companies because they no longer had to deal with those empties and the labor costs and the trucking costs and the washing and the refilling. Now they push the costs onto us, right? Who pays the costs of dealing with an empty bottle? It's you and me through our taxes or the fees that we pay to our garbage collector, however it's done where you live. So this was a gigantic source of profit for the industry. And that's why when I hear people, when this is very common, I think, tell me that they feel guilty about the amount of plastic that they are throwing out, it just makes my blood boil, right? Because we don't actually really have the option when you go into the supermarket now of buying single-use items. Yes, you could go to the green eco store, the refill store, and God bless those stores. They're great. I don't minimize the importance of demonstrating the viability of that model. But most people cannot do that. It's more expensive. It's time consuming. We really don't have a choice when we go into the supermarket. So when I hear people say that they feel guilty, you just want to tell them that this is not you, right? The industry built this world that we live in. It didn't happen by accident. It didn't come from customer demand. This industry loves to talk about how they're responding to consumer demand. People want convenience, etc. But they built it. They took away the other option. We don't have the choice of refill now and returning your bottle to Coke or whatever. That's, to me, the most important nugget of how we got where we are today.
Thanks so much, Lloyd Stouffer.
Yep.
Your answer there really makes plain the fact that we weren't just sold plastic. We were sold the disposable mindset. We were sold disposability. And you mentioned guilt there. It's so interesting because these major players who strategically built this disposable world so that they could make boatloads of money, they win when we feel guilty, because when we feel guilty, we are not pointing the finger where we should be pointing it, right? We're
Exactly.
essentially, guilt is essentially pointing the finger at us. One of the things that you write in your book that really, again, made my blood boil was on the personal responsibility piece. You made the case that the plastics industries played up personal responsibility as a means of deflecting from their actual responsibility. Can you speak on that a little bit?
Yeah, and I think the very clear analogy is to the idea of the personal carbon footprint, right? This is all about shifting the lens onto ourselves and making the change within our own lives. So, one of the most shocking to me stories in the book is this story of Keep America Beautiful. And if you're old enough like me to have been watching TV in the 1970s, you might remember this ad called The Crying Indian. That was one of the most sort of iconic images in American TV in that era. And the tagline of that ad, which shows this sort of stereotypical looking Native American guy paddling a canoe down a really polluted river, and then suddenly he's on the side of a highway and people are throwing trash at his feet and the tear comes down his cheek. And the tagline is, "People start pollution, people can stop it." So, this ad was made by an organization called Keep America Beautiful, which was an anti-littering campaign. What could possibly sound more anodyne and more benevolent than keeping America beautiful and being against litter? Of course, littering is bad. Most people, I think, and I include myself, would have perceived Keep America Beautiful and this ad as coming from a sort of a neutral, kind of like a civic organization, right? Trying to do something good in the world. In fact, Keep America Beautiful was an industry organization started in the 1950s after Vermont passed a ban on throwaway cans. So we're not even talking about plastic yet, but here's this model of disposability instead of refill. And the original supporters of Keep America Beautiful included Coke and Pepsi, Philip Morris Tobacco, the American Can Company. And the idea here, the tagline of Keep America Beautiful was, keeping America beautiful is your job, right? Here they are putting up billboards and running ads in newspapers about littering and telling us that it's our job to keep America beautiful. So there is a lot to unpick there. Number one, very clearly, they are shifting the burden, shifting the blame of this littering problem. And this is a moment as the campaigns progressed through the 1960s and into the 70s, that people were actually becoming very concerned about waste because the disposability was growing, single-use packaging. Cities across the country were groaning under the financial burden of having to manage really massively growing amounts of waste. So here they are shifting the blame for this problem onto us as individuals. So it's not about these companies that are producing all of this packaging, but it's just about, they coined the term litter bugs, a few irresponsible individuals who are failing to dispose of their trash properly. But it's not only actually a blame shifting. What they were actually doing there, and it was so successful in this framing, is really still with us today. And I think many of us have even internalized it. They were actually redefining even what the problem was, right? So what they're saying with this anti-littering campaign is that as long as all this trash, all these packages, these empty containers and the bags and the bottles, as long as they end up in the right place, in the trash can, not in the ocean or on the side of the road, then everything is fine, right? There's no problem with the fact that the amount of plastic and the amount of single-use packaging being produced is going up every year. If you look back at history, in 1950, the industry globally produced 2 million tons of plastic. Today, we're over 500 million tons annually. So they would like us to think that as long as all of that ends up in the right place, it's not thrown in the ocean or whatever, then no problem with that increase from 2 to 500 million tons. So I think that is like the original kind of framing, right? It's where the industry set out this idea that they have just hammered home ever since, that the problem of plastic is on us. It's our job to clean it up. It's our fault for demanding it in the first place. And don't look at us, who's pumping out more of this stuff every year than the year before. And it's been successful, I think, to a very large degree.
Oh, so successful. Too successful. Yeah, anybody with eyes over the decades could see that plastic is a growing problem. And those people paying attention rightly found themselves concerned. But then enters recycling to
Yes.
assuage those concerns. You said, as long as we put all this plastic in the right place, we're fine.
Mm.
You were told that the right place to put all this plastic was the recycling bin. But again, your book does an amazing job at talking about how recycling, in a lot of ways, is another deflection, greenwashing,
Yep.
perhaps. My listeners know that these days, only about 9% of all plastics are recycled. Can you talk to me a little bit about how recycling was marketed to concerned citizens as a solution to plastic proliferation?
Yeah. So this is so interesting, right? And I don't want to say that there's no value to recycling plastic. There is some limited value to it. But I think what you see when you look back over the years is, like you said, there's these moments and it's constantly percolating up, this public concern about plastic, because people can see there's a problem and it's growing year after year. In the 1980s, there was this like wandering garbage barge that was in the headlines day after day that couldn't get a port to accept it for it to dump all this trash. A few years ago, there was this huge upsurge in like viral videos of plastic pollution in the ocean. And there's other moments in between those two where this concern is just like bubbling up. And the industry has always understood that public concern poses a threat, because whenever the public is worried and upset about something, there's always a possibility that will translate into some kind of political or policy action. In this case, bans on certain single-use items or other sorts of regulations that might shrink their markets for selling more plastic. So they've always understood that they need to manage this public concern. They need to find ways to diffuse it. And nothing has been more effective than recycling. So there's an author named Susan Frankel who 15 or so years ago spoke to an industry lobbyist, a plastic industry lobbyist, and he used the phrase guilt eraser about recycling. The industry understood that recycling was a way to ease people's guilt and to just make us feel okay about all this plastic that we were throwing out. But what the industry also understood was that the actual potential of recycling to really play a significant role in managing plastic waste was much more limited. So if you're talking about other materials like, aluminum cans, cardboard boxes, glass bottles, recycling is really very valuable, right? It's always actually better to use less because recycling has its own footprint. We should be using less throwaway packaging, fewer containers. If you're recycling those items, that material can be reprocessed over and over again. With plastic, it's really a different story. There's a limited role for a couple of kinds of plastic: the water bottles, the soda bottles. This is a type of plastic called PET. Milk jugs is a plastic called HDPE. These are the ones and the twos, usually, if you know that symbol on the side of the package that you see so frequently. Those can be recycled in a sort of limited way, one or two times around, and the quality really deteriorates, and it ends up becoming a park bench or a fleece or something rather than another bottle. So that's not really recycling. They call it downcycling, right? But that's only a small percentage of plastic. Most of the other kinds, very hard to recycle. And the obstacles are not only technical, they're also logistical, because plastic is really a complicated material from a chemical perspective. There's so many different kinds of plastic. A lot of packages actually have multiple plastics, different layers, different materials. They can't be recycled together. So how are you going to separate all of those? And economically, there's no reason to, because it's actually cheaper and better quality from virgin plastic straight from fossil fuels. The actual sort of real world utility of recycling in plastic is not zero, but it's fairly limited. But as a marketing strategy, it was way more significant. I actually interviewed the guy who invented the recycling symbol, It was part of a contest that he entered back in, I think, the late 60s or the early 70s at University of Southern California, sponsored by a cardboard box company. It was originally intended to be used around paper and cardboard. And he said to me, please don't turn this into something negative because I'm really proud of that design. And he's absolutely right. But the problem is that the plastic industry grabbed a hold of that image, the three chasing arrows design that is so ubiquitous now, and just started slapping it on everything, on, every kind of packaging, regardless of whether it really could successfully be processed or even whether any municipal recycling facility was able to accept it.
Yeah, I didn't grow up in the 90s. I'm an 80s child, but I started paying attention in the 90s, and recycling was all the rage, right? Just recycle. And then our disposable lifestyle is benign. But I think that public awareness of recycling's vast limitations is growing. And yet at the same time, we have the new quote unquote magic pill, which is chemical recycling. It is being
Yes.
touted as the singular solution. Oh, actually, conventional recycling, that didn't do it. But now chemical recycling is going to solve all our plastic problems. These industries are really pushing chemical recycling as the solution. But are they pushing chemical recycling as the solution just so that they can keep making plastic? Are they pushing chemical recycling so that the public, so that you and me look to the left when the problem is really to the right?
Yes. So one activist I spoke to said to me that he sees chemical recycling as more of a narrative solution than an actual solution. So chemical recycling, this is the idea, as the companies describe it, that plastic can be taken back to the molecular level. You are actually like breaking this material down to molecules, and then they can be recombined through this complex sort of petrochemical process into new plastic. And they say that this sort of gets around a lot of the problems that we were talking about earlier with regular recycling, which is called mechanical recycling, and that you can mix different kinds of plastics together. The quality is very good. There was an ad from, I think it was ExxonMobil, that said chip bag can be turned into a Ferrari, right? Like they love to talk about this, that this sort of obviates all of the limitations that we've been talking about around recycling of plastics. You could spend a lot of time unpicking that, but basically chemical recycling is hugely toxic. It has a gigantic carbon footprint of its own. And I would say from the experts that I spoke to that the benefits of it are vastly exaggerated. But it's interesting to see how central the industry sees this as being to its PR campaigns, its reputational efforts, and this idea of kind of the guilt eraser, right? Because there was a big lawsuit filed against ExxonMobil by Rob Bonta, the Attorney General of California, specifically around plastic recycling and accusing ExxonMobil of perpetuating fraud on consumers through its false claims about recycling historically over many years, but also including chemical recycling. ExxonMobil was so upset about this that they sued him back. They countersued the Attorney General of California, and that is still pending because they understand how important this is to sort of maintaining their reputation and maintaining the reputation of plastic and the markets for single-use plastics in consumers' minds, and this idea of, again, the guilt eraser. So I think that really speaks to the centrality that the industry views this with. It depends on a lot of counting techniques. You move the numbers around and make the plastic item that you might be buying a bottle or something in a store. It says 50% recycled plastics. That depends on a lot of tricky accounting, basically.
You write in Plastic Inc. that the fossil fuels and plastic industries are greedy and they have an utter disregard for their consequences. You also say that looking these facts in the face is empowering. How so?
Yeah, I mean, so this is sticky area for an environmental writer. And a book like this, a number of times that I have heard people say, some casual acquaintance or whatever, I'm telling about my book, oh, that sounds depressing. So this is the sort of bane of environmental journalism, right? It is depressing and it's very daunting. And as we've been talking about, I've tried to shift the framing away from this individual action and onto sort of a corporate accountability framing, which leads you to look at this gigantic multi-billion, multi-hundreds of billion-dollar industry that has been basically spending decades pushing plastic onto us and tricking us with all these different kinds of framings about recycling and about personal responsibility and everything that we've been talking about. So, I mean, I fully obviously get that is really daunting, right? And this is hard. It's tough to live in the world that we live in now and see these corporations that are behaving in just incredibly shocking and unethical ways, right? These companies understand the impact of their actions and they're doing it anyway because it's all about the bottom line and the stock price. So, I am a journalist, so we live in an era of fake news and conspiracy theories and social media hoaxes and all of that. But I guess on some fundamental level, I do still believe that facts matter and that if you don't understand the problem, you can't begin to fix it, right? You need an accurate diagnosis. And even though so many of us, and I've talked about myself being one of these people, trying so hard to use less plastic in our own lives, I think we get that it does feel kind of futile, right? To be that person bringing all the bags to the grocery store, but yet you come home with everything packaged in plastic, even if you don't have the bags, right? So I think to let go of that guilt and that sort of small scale, small bore solutions, really, on some level, it is empowering to understand that this is not about us. We need an accurate understanding of who is causing this problem. It's not us as individuals. It's these gigantic corporations. And by the way, the politicians who have failed to rein them in and all of the big money that has poisoned our politics. So that is a lot, right? And it's hard to find hope in politics these days. One thing that I do see with plastic is that a lot of times some pretty effective action has bubbled up from the local level. Restrictions on plastic in little towns and sort of individual cities and counties and states, they have a wider power, I think. And they tend to be contagious. The industry understands that. A town puts a fee on plastic bags, a 10-cent fee or whatever it is. The usage goes down by like 80%. And people see, oh, actually, the world didn't really end, right? That potentially holds a lot of power. So I get that this is a little bit overwhelming, but I also think that anger is a more empowering emotion than despair. And when we can get there, I think we can see that there is scope for action, and then at least the action will be directed in the right way.
I like that. Yeah. As an editor at an environmental nonprofit, I hear what you're saying there. When we report on these big, pressing existential issues, the conversation can veer into hopelessness. Mm-hmm. But actually, your book didn't make me feel hopeless. It made me feel really darn angry. And
I'm glad.
I love working from a place of anger because that anger motivates me. So for listeners who are hearing our conversation today and are also feeling really darn angry, what do you hope they do or take into their own lives?
First of all, I hope they take this new understanding and they can finally let go of the guilt and see that this is not on us and redirect their gaze and their efforts towards this industry. And the only way that they can be reined in is through effective government action. I always like to use the example of this organization called Beyond Plastics. I interviewed the director. Her name is Judith Enck. They're based in Vermont out of Bennington College. Judith used to be an employee at the Environmental Protection Agency. And what she does and what that organization does is people come to them, right? They're concerned about plastics. Beyond Plastics is offering training to help individuals to lobby their local government, lobby their state government for, it might be small steps, right? A ban on straws, a ban on styrofoam, a fee on plastic bags. These kinds of measures have more power than you might think. And by the way, the industry knows that, because whenever any little town or little city starts taking action on plastic, the industry throws everything they've got in terms of lobbying dollars and muscle at stopping it, because they understand that these things are contagious, right? But this is all about a way of converting anger into political action and change on a policy level. And personal action, personal responsibility can be not only about sort of our own plastic use in our individual lives, but about taking action in the political arena. And that can be pretty meaningful.
You heard it here first, everybody. Take some action in the political arena. Don't just throw up your hands. I look at plastic as one of the great environmental threats of our time, along with PFAS, along with climate change, of course. But it's not the time to sit back and say, oh, this is just the way the world is these days, or, oh, I can't do anything about it. I'm just one person. So, Beth, one more time, the title of your book is Plastic Inc., The Secret History and Shocking Future of Big Oil's Biggest Bet. I have linked to it in the show notes for listeners. Go read it. It's so good. Beth, thank you so much for your time. I really enjoyed talking to you. Thank you.
Thank you, Stephanie. It's been a great conversation. I really appreciate your having me on, and it was great talking to you too.
Listeners, that's a wrap. My friends, show notes are at mamaminimalist.com/592. I have nothing to say except that this is a listener-supported show. I haven't made my claim for that in a while, but we don't have lots of sponsors. Old Navy's not sponsoring my show. Shein's not sponsoring my show. And so what keeps it in production is all of you who think it's valuable and want to support it financially. So only you know if you're in a place to support a little old podcast financially. But if you are, I would so greatly appreciate you considering supporting this one. Thank you so much. We'll be back next week. We're talking about a good night's sleep, and I'll see you then. Thanks for being here. Thanks for caring, and take care.